Welcome to Teach, Learn, Share, a podcast that thoughtfully explores teaching and learning practices in higher ed. I'm Jasmine Perrin, an educational development and digital learning designer. This podcast is brought to you by Teaching and Academic Programs at McGill University, also known as TAP. We're recording today from Montreal, Quebec, on unceded land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. We honor their stewardship as we live and work on these lands. Welcome back to another episode of the fifth series of our podcast, Teaching in the Era of Gen AI. I'm here with the co-host of this great series, Adam Finkelstein, the Associate Director of Learning Environments at TAP. Hi, Adam.
Hey, Jasmine. It's great to be here at yet another one of our really interesting podcasts. We've had a really fun season, and this looks to be a unique opportunity, I think, for everybody involved. So very excited.
So as we all know, generative AI is reshaping higher education at just about every level, from how courses are designed, how learning is assessed, how faculty teach, and importantly, how students prepare for their professional futures. It also challenges these longstanding assumptions about what higher education does best and what it's meant to do best. And what are the things that Gen AI can do for us in our professional lives versus what only humans should be doing. And for institutions, the challenge is no longer adoption, but adaptation. So how are we going to thoughtfully respond to a technology that's evolving faster than these structures that traditionally govern teaching and learning? In this episode, we're joined by Associate and Vice Provosts of Teaching and Learning from three of Canada's leading universities, Professor Chris Buddle from McGill University, Dr. Simon Bates from University of British Columbia, and Professor Susan McCann from University of Toronto. This episode is divided into three parts where we'll be exploring from their vantage point as senior academic leaders what the opportunities Gen AI presents, the challenges, the structural constraints that it raises, and how universities can uphold things like academic integrity, supporting faculty, and ultimately preparing students for a labor market that's fundamentally being reshaped by Gen AI. In this first part, we're going to focus on opportunities. So Chris, Simon, Susan, welcome. It's a pleasure to have all three of you here with us today together. Since we have a bit of a full house on air, I think it's important to give listeners a sense of who they're listening to when you're speaking. So I'd like to ask each of you to introduce yourself, state your role, your institution, and one sentence, if possible, about how Gen AI is currently showing up in your portfolio. Simon, let's start with you.
Great. Thanks, Jasmine. Really, really happy to be here. So I'm Simon Bates. I'm Vice Provost and Associate Vice President for Teaching and Learning at UBC in Vancouver. I'm also Professor of Teaching in our Department of Physics and Astronomy. Hard task being asked to talk about AI in one sentence and where it's showing up in my work. And Susan is not going to thank me for this, but it's everywhere. Covers all aspects, teaching and learning on credit courses, lifelong learning and continuing education, academic integrity, learning technology. All those things are in my portfolio, and AI is touching all of them, and it's touching other parts of the university as well, research operations. So everywhere is my one-word answer.
So I'm Professor Susan McCann. I'm a professor in mechanical and industrial engineering at the University of Toronto. And I'm currently serving in two vice provostal roles. One is Vice Provost Innovations in Undergraduate Education, and the other is an Associate Vice President and Vice Provost Digital Strategies role. And it shows up in both of those portfolios. So in Innovations in Undergraduate Education, it is showing up in all of the places that Simon mentioned, teaching methods, assessment, and I think the way in which faculty are thinking about learning outcomes for students. In digital strategies, it is a very large part of that portfolio as we are thinking about the implementation of the recommendations out of an AI task force report that we recently published.
And I'm Chris Buttle, Associate Provost of Teaching and Academic Planning at McGill, and I oversee academic program development, online programs, and teaching success and supporting our instructors. And I would say it's the same answer as Simon and Susan. It really is everywhere, although the one piece I would add is I don't think people realize broadly that it is everywhere. And I think there's sort of an undercurrent where there's some denial still that's happening in different sectors. But really the way I see it, in some areas it's more visible, obviously learning technologies, or we think about online learning, or we think about the ways that some new programs are being developed, or we look at certificate development where people are talking about skill development. It's very prominent, but in other areas it's there. I don't think we fully realize it yet.
So I want to intentionally begin the conversation on a positive note. I'd like to start with looking forward. So from a senior leadership perspective, generative AI is often framed as either a disruption or as merely a tool, but rarely as an opportunity. From your vantage point as associate or vice provost, what are the biggest opportunities Gen AI poses to teaching and learning over the next 5 years?
I mean, I think there are some of the obvious ones like really incredible simulations that we can enable in courses, personalized learning. I think assessment is often seen as one of the most challenging parts, but it is also, I think, enormously full of opportunity as we think about new ways of designing assessment and doing assessment. I'd also say that on a sort of meta level, using AI to consider things like success for students and retention, and how do we support students through programs of study beyond within a silo of a course, but really across courses and across their learning experience at the university. I think there are enormous opportunities there. We are looking at applying AI to analyze things like retention data and what that's telling us about students. And so it's easy to sort of say personalized learning and simulations. I think the devil is going to be in the details as we get down into what does that actually look like as we design these things out in ways that do not separate students from human interaction or from interaction with instructors, but really actually support human interaction and conversations within a community of scholars and learning. And that's one of the big challenges, but it's also an opportunity for us to really think about how do we design AI technologies in ways that actually amplify human interaction and human communities of learning.
Do you have any specific examples of how U of T is approaching some of these potential opportunities now?
So I think we are doing some of the things that many universities are doing, enabling AI tutors in some of our classes. So we have about 95 classes this year that have AI tutors operating in those classes. And we are also, there's numerous examples of faculty using AI for creating case studies or sort of simulations. I think we're seeing simulations show up most in our career centers with things like mock interviews and so on. But I think we'll see more and more of that coming into the classroom. In terms of assessment, I was saying to you all before we started recording that I just came from a conversation at our Faculty of Music, and one of the instructors there was talking about the ways in which he incorporated AI into a writing assignment with his students, where they did some in-class writing and then went out of class, worked with AI outside of class, and then came back in again. And the value that he found to rethinking his writing assignments in that way and what he found out of that experience. I think in terms of supporting human-to-human interactions and not allowing the technology to get between us in those learning conversations, that's going to be a challenge that we need to keep in mind as we adopt this technology, because I don't think the technology or our use of it is mature enough yet to see where some of the real challenges are going to be to that. to that work.
Simon, what about you, and how is UBC approaching some of these opportunities?
Yeah, well, many of the same things that Susan highlighted. I'd add one other example to the list of opportunities, and that is around supporting accessibility and inclusive education. I think as assistive technologies, there's an awful lot of potential there for what we might be able to do. Used appropriately, I think these tools are going to be able to give learners superpowers in terms of what is possible with them. But the key thing is that phrase, if used appropriately. And I know we'll dig into the challenges a little bit later, but this is not easy. And I think understanding that balance between opportunity and challenge gives you a good sense of why there are such diverse perspectives about the potential and how we should be using these tools. How they're used, where they're used, if they're used, back to Susan's point about not wanting to undermine the human aspects of learning, that really matters in terms of faculty context, discipline, and course context. So that's a process of discovery and ideation for the people who are the subject matter experts in those disciplines and courses. The way that we've been trying to approach this centrally within UBC is to provide spaces and tools and support that enable that process of discovery of faculty. Because as we've already heard, it's a landscape that's changing very, very quickly. It's only been 3 years since these tools were first, broadly available with ChatGPT. And even in that relatively short time period, there's a short time period in an institutional context, huge advances in terms of what models can do, huge enhancements in the way that these tools are being built into other digital applications that people use routinely, to the point where now I think it's pretty hard not to use a tool that is somehow AI enabled. You do a Google search and there's an AI summary at the top and various other applications. So our approach is built on providing these spaces, and the way we talk about it is 3 pillars: listening, learning, and experimenting. Listening is really about seeking feedback from faculty, from staff, and critically from students, because guess what? It turns out our students have really important perspectives and really quite nuanced perspectives. They are concerned about many of the same things that we are concerned about as educators. And I think it does our students a great disservice to sort of not include them in this conversation and sort of, go back to the familiar territory of, well, they'll just use it to cheat. So providing spaces to gather feedback, listening to what people have to say, and how that changes over time. And it is changing over time. Even in the last couple of years, people's perspectives are changing as they learn a little bit more, as they get a little bit more familiar. Learning is around supporting skill development, whether that's for faculty or for students. And I know we'll talk more a little bit about literacy and fluency development later. And then this idea of experimenting, providing spaces where faculty members can play, can experiment, can try things out in a way that is safe in terms of data and protecting data privacy, in exactly the same way our research environments protect sensitive data that's used for research projects and research applications. So we've been supporting all of those. We've directed some teaching and learning enhancement grant funding into pilot projects that have allowed us to get familiar with what it means to actually support faculty in this space. And the majority of faculty are not necessarily AI or technological experts, nor should they have to be. They shouldn't have to bear the burden of being able to keep up with a very, very fast-paced technological environment. We need them to be able to focus on the pedagogical or the scholarly questions that they have around their teaching and learning.
Yeah, the benefit of going third is I can say, everything that Susan and Simon said, but I will add, I guess, a couple of pieces. We often talk about the pandemic as being this sort of great disruptor of higher education. But when we think back on it, in many cases, we quote, switched online or went online, but we didn't change other practices maybe as much as we could have. It was often the kind of format of how we thought about teaching and assessment went to a different modality, but didn't necessarily change fundamentally. And that's not across the board. But I think in a lot of cases, it was just about, using what we already do and now doing it over Zoom or Teams instead of in a classroom setting. To me, when I think the opportunity with AI is that it is actually deeply different than the pandemic in that it is so embedded and will fundamentally shake the very foundations of how we think, especially about assessment. I think that's one of the very core points, but in many, many other areas, how we think of this balance between content delivery and inquiry-based learning, how we think about engagement in a classroom differently. I think this is an opportunity that the higher ed sector it hasn't seen ever in recent history, even though we had a pandemic. So I think that's extremely exciting. And we can look at AI as really being this opportunity to say, well, what is a university? What is our true mission? And how do we think about what learning actually means from a student's perspective, from an instructor's perspective? What does teaching actually mean? And we had a symposium last fall about relationship-rich teaching and learning experiences and how relationships are very fundamental to how we think about teaching and learning. But often in a classroom setting, it's not about relationships. So what I see is AI doing is very fundamentally allowing us to flip everything on its head and say, well, let's bring back this idea of what is teaching and learning, what is learning, how does relational activities work in this context, and AI is our companion on this journey. It is a disruptor, but then we use it as a companion and we ask these fundamental questions about, assessment, content, etc., and look at the relationships. That to me is a more, I guess, existential kind of answer to the question, Jasmine, but I think a really interesting opportunity. On a much more practical perspective, there are all kinds of sort of habits that we've gotten into around teaching and learning and assessment over decades that might finally die. And I think this is a reason to celebrate. And as an example, let's be honest, for decades, maybe not decades, years, it's been difficult to actually know who's written a paper. Sure, a student will say, I've written a term paper and I'm going to hand it in. And maybe some universities had software that might detect plagiarism, but it's always been an arms race and difficult to figure out. Well, hallelujah, we now have Gen AI, which means we can never assume anyone is an author anymore, which means we get to assess in different ways and think differently about learning outcomes. That's really, really exciting. So I think it's an opportunity to turn some of these practices that have always been maybe not the best pedagogical approaches. Now we can actually do things differently. And I think briefly at McGill, I think one of the things I'm excited about in terms of what we've done is, and this is largely through the leadership within Adam's team and others, about creating a learning community where instructors come together and share their use cases, share their ideas. This is, I think, what we need to do. And Simon and Susan spoke a bit about this as well, is people have to get together and talk about the ideas, talk about the use cases, the examples, the tools. And that's really going to be, again, a great opportunity to galvanize people around one piece of society that's quite disruptive and not in a negative way necessarily.
If I could just add, I think it's interesting that as I walk around the university, people come up to me and ask how they could get involved in shaping the direction of the university in this area. I rarely have people come up and volunteer or eagerly approach me to be on committees. But this is one where, they want to know what's going on. They want to be involved. There's a real sense that this is important and that they want to hear what other people are doing and have to say about it. I think to Chris's point, it is a fulcrum for conversation. That, we always look for fulcrums for conversation in teaching and learning. And this is a huge one.
All right. So that brings us to the end of part 1 of this conversation. And what a great conversation it was to kind of get us started on this topic with some really awesome guests. What really stood out for me in this particular part is how strongly the guests framed Gen AI as a catalyst for rethinking things in teaching, learning, and assessment. And as we've heard, Chris ended with framing AI as disruptive, but not necessarily in a negative way, which to me is such a powerful kind of flip of script here. I think that it makes us realize that disruptions can be painful, but they can require us to invoke meaningful change, and maybe finally in the realm of higher ed. So it's not to say that the evolution that we're facing is going to be easy and not require a lot of work. But I think and I hope that at the end, it will lead to some more positive outcomes in general for teaching and learning as a whole. And in the same vein, I really appreciate that this is making us ask these deeper questions about what universities are actually for and what we value in learning.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right, Jasmine. And I think one of the interesting things about disruptions is, even if you look historically, is that they don't necessarily have a negative or positive consequence onto themselves. It's sort of how we react to that disruption. And I think that's one of the interesting things here that all of our panelists really talked about, is this idea of taking advantage of this disruption to do newer and better things with teaching and learning. And I think that idea of re-examining, long-standing assumptions about our assessment and how we work, rethinking our course design, thinking about our core mission, all of these things lead us to be able to improve based on reflection. And of course, we're all in teaching and learning. We know that, the way to improve is through reflective practice. And I think this is a great example of being able to start doing that. And if there's one thing, I'm really taking away from that conversation too, is that it's really all about the action. It's that we have to do something. We can't just sort of sit and watch the disruption occur, hoping that it'll be over. It's not the case. And we know that AI is not going anywhere. And this kind of disruption really leads itself to having us take action to be successful, and to really think about designing things in, and really think about how can it be beneficial for me in my work, or for my students in my teaching, or even in my research. So that's great. It was just a great conversation. I'm looking forward to our next section as we move forward in this great topic.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, so it's like highlighting the potential for opportunity, and it's really at the end of the day up to us to get there,
Exactly.
or how we react to this disruption.
Absolutely.
And one other small thing that I appreciated, and I feel like all of the guests kind of talked about at some point, is the notion that it's now more than ever driving the need for community and space to discuss and experiment with peers. And to me, that's interesting, because something that is, AI is thought to potentially remove the human out of so many tasks. It's actually making people want to connect more and exchange with each other. So that's kind of an interesting piece that I pulled out as well. And so just to highlight, things like our learning community at TAP, at McGill, that we have, where instructors do have the opportunity to exchange. I think that it's a really important type of support.
Absolutely. One of the most important things that we can do is help provide channels and opportunities for instructors to share practice and talk to each other and be able to further reflect on their own teaching.
So in our next episode, we are going to shift into looking at the structural challenges and the tensions around assessment and faculty workload, and exploring the idea that learning isn't meant to be frictionless. So if part 1 is about what's possible, part 2 is about what it takes to get there. So we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Please subscribe to Teach, Learn, Share, and let others know about it. Until next time.